Hi everyone, my name is Estrella Rosetta and today we'll be talking about the rise of the division. Okay, so a little overview we'll be discussing in this presentation is the rise of division that the United States experienced by increasing political polarization, differences of culture, and social divisions. So on this side, we have a little bit of the table of contents, historical roots of division, the impact of the civil rights movement and post-war era, the rise of partisan politics, economic and disparities, and philosophical differences, contemporary factors, and media influence. So starting with the historical roots of division in the 19th and 20th century, there were several historical events that have contributed to politics, economic, and philosophical divisions in the United States from the founding to the 19th and 20th century. During the founding era, which took place in 1789 and 1850, established conflicting ideals and created a system with inherited tensions. These divisions centered on state rights, national bank, and interpretation of the Constitution that evolved throughout the 19th and 20th century by impacting debates like on slavery, economic policy, and social reform. Quote unquote, friction between them increased as intention shifted from the creation of new federal government to the question of how powerful the federal government would be. So that for economics, the stress disagreement that led to debate over the nation bank was that this reflected on economic divisions of the Federalists that was led then by Alexander Hamilton, who believed in a strong overall national economy, as well as the anti-Federalists that consisted of Thomas Jefferson, who believed in more of a state rights instead of a centralized economy. For political, it was that this era was a ratification of the Constitution. It was to create the political system based on Republican ideals, addressing concerns about citizens' rights by adding the Bill of Rights, guaranteeing the fundamental and freedom to all people. The Constitution itself became a battleground for all kinds of situations and like balance of power between the federal and state government. For philosophical, it was set up the idea that all people are created and equal, despite whether they are different in genetic backgrounds. All the people must have their fundamental rights, such as freedom of speech, liberty, and the rights listed in the Constitution, like pursuit happiness as well. This also was many Americans agreed with them, but some found that the ideology was far more acceptable in the abstract than its practice. So this meant that there was different perspectives that led to division in the country because of their different points of views. So the evolution of the divisions in the 19th and 20th century was that although they believed in a strong government and fundamentals of rights, the issue of the slavery and the scale of more political and economic tensions that then led to the Civil War. Although these evolution divisions still existed because of the debate of the role of government and economy, which started in the founding era, to this day it continues with different parties like the Democratic and Republican Party, as well as the ideological holding different perspectives on taxation, regulations, and programs. So basically, it still adds up to this day because there's two different parties that we'll later be talking about and how it's still dividing us as a nation. And yeah. So a little bit also of the historical roots of division was that the Civil War and Reconstruction era was also an historical event that was based on the disagreement that the Union and the Confederate States had between each other over slavery and state rights. The Reconstruction was a period that followed the war and rebuilding the South by formally addressing the status of formerly enslaved people. So for political was that the Civil War became difficult due to the division between the North and the South based on the different perspective used on slavery and state rights. The North asserted its dominance by abolishing slavery. Then they brought the Reconstruction, granting voting rights and passage amendments to the Constitution. This economic was a system of the economy where exclusive different the overall conflict of banking, tariffs, and policies. And so for the philosophical was that in the Civil War and the Reconstruction pushed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment correction in order to abolish slavery and grant rights to them. This meant that the concept of granting equality, justice, and the government protection to the African American people, because they actually didn't have any of that. So many white people did not care about it and turned violence in response changes to the radical Reconstruction. So the war exposed deep economic disparities. The South reliance on slave labor and agriculture versus the North, began industrialization and the political struggle over slavery and state rights. This meant that the war intensified these differences. So, and also, this also led to the Emancipation Proclamation, both enriched that the South with its promise of freedom of their slaves that it threatened that very existence on its primary labor source. So this was the act that granted freedom, but enslaved still challenges. But the enslaved people still faced several challenges, which led on to the segregation that had occurred in the 19th century and by the Jim Crow era. So then this worsened the situation by increasing the segregation, like I said, in the South on the African American, despite that they were free from all, but they still had to face challenges that caused segregation in employment, housing, education, public areas, and much more. So the legacy of slavery in the Civil War era resonates to this day in debates over race and social justice and equality. Okay, so impact on the Civil War movement and post-war era on the economy. The Civil Rights movement and post-war era shaped current society relations divisions that were challenged by existing inequalities and encouraging social change in race and class. It came along with a shift from manufacturing to a service based on economy. So what this meant was that the post-war economy boom, while beneficial to many, also exacerbated existing inequalities and created new ones as the economy shifted from manufacturing to several-based model. This was the result that led to the discrimination segregation in the 1920th century. Like I said, this ultimately led to the segregation that had occurred in the 19th century in the South, which didn't allow African Americans, well, it did allow them, but they were so limited on employment, housing, education, and opportunities. So this kind of led them to having less opportunities and not being able to pursue education because they were privileging the whites. And so this ultimately, and during the economy, had them face a lot of poverty because their wealth was not able to increase. So later on, during the Civil Act of 1964, it was the racial wealth gap that led to many African Americans in the cycle of poverty and economic struggles. Like I said, because of the segregation that was occurring, they were facing a lot of poverty and economic struggles. So the lack of sophisticated wealth meant that African Americans over time their wealth could not grow. Like I said, since they didn't have these resources, they could not even like advance like their social class, you know. So like I said, this all started from the Jim Crow era by legalizing segregation and allowing it. From slavery to Jim Crow, from redlining to school segregation, and from mass incarceration to environmental racism, policies have consistently impeded and inhibited African Americans from having access to opportunities to realize the American dream. This demonstrates the struggle that blacks face in order to keep up with the whites still leaving them behind. So this was kind of very controversial of what the American dream meant, because as we all know, the American dream is liberty, freedom, being able to make more money, but this was totally the opposite of that. And so the civil rights movement made it legal to eliminate segregation in American society, but not the racial inequality. So although civil rights led to not having segregation, there was still discrimination going on that the whites still practiced. So the system racism continued in the fact areas mentioned. They contributed in racial divisions. So the post-era was economic boom that came with the widespread of unemployment and rising living standards for many, but wasn't even evenly distributed. The shift from manufacturing to a service-based economy, particularly in the South, meant that many formerly manufacturing jobs were lost, leaving many in poverty. So like I said, there was job openings, but yet there was still a lot of poverty going on. So this overall economy was affected by the civil rights movement and most war because it granted civil rights to impassionated African Americans during the Reconstruction era that then led to the Civil War. So then this led to the Civil Act movement by increasing income and jobs. Although through the legislation by the Act of 1964, the movement dismantled segregation in employment, housing, and education, which then helped improve the economy for many blacks. This overall boosted the South economy by opening opportunities and pursuit of education by obtaining a career with better pay. So then it later on, by the act of the civil rights, it allowed more opportunities and education, and it allowed the blacks to pursue a career which later on paid more to their salary of what they were winning. And so the civil rights movement not just impacted politically and philosophical, but the economy system by dismantling discrimination practices that kept then African Americans from achieving economic prosperity. So this led the United States view the problem of poverty that was going on in the hearts of the African Americans. And so the rise of the partisan politics is that the partisan politics refers to a situation where individuals or groups strongly align with a particular political party. So they are often committed to the party in today's society, left or liberals, and right or conservatives. So what this means was that in today's day, we still live in a division of like the rise of division in politics because there's two parties, which consists of the Republican Party, which is the conservative, which is the right, and then there's the Democratic, which is the left, and they are called liberals. And so the United States is made out of two, like I said, red and blue. And so an example of the left side, which is the Democratic Party, is that they believe the belief of expansion of government, like in education, healthcare, raises a minimum wage. While on the other side, economic policies would be lowered on taxes on the rich and limited on government regulations that consist of social policy. And also estimate like immigration, deportations, and limitation to access to abortion. So basically what this is saying is that the Republicans believe more like in mortality and a limited government, as in for Democratic, they believe in the social equality among all people and being able to provide more programs and opportunities. So this connects to the divided vision that it creates that racism towards marginalized groups. And so also the Republican also really do believe a lot in like the marginalized groups that we Hispanic, blacks, Asian, you name it, are not allowed to be here because we come from different places and we don't blend in with what the whites. And so the overlap between the political values of Democrats and Republicans shrank between 1994 and 2017 as the share of the Americans with ideology consistent values increased. So that what that meant is that 53% of Africans say that they're talking about politics with people they disagree with is generally stressful and frustrating. This comes to prove that these recent decades can cause conflict by just talking about them. So like now you can't really talk about politics because it literally leads on to like conflict and divisions and just a lot of things. And so both parties have more ideological centers since the 1970s. In the past 5 years, Congress has become more conservative. So to this day, Congress has actually become more conservative. We are right now, as 2025, we are in a Republican Party. And so as Democrats had grown more liberals over time and Republicans much more conservative, the middle where moderate to liberal Republicans could sometimes find common ground with moderate to conservative Democrats on contentious issues has vanished. So there's not been a time where like we're in the middle, you know, like two of the parties will unite and think and agree on what they want. It's more like this disagreements leading them to more of a side. And so this demonstrates how the rise of the partisan politics has shifted from the middle and caused them to lean on one side more than causing the division among the people due to the beliefs. So then later on lead to disagreements and more conflict in society since there's no agreement. And so, like, right now, we do live in a society where, like, instead of us being in the middle, united as a nation, we are more towards divided because there's different perspectives and different agreements, different